The auction paddle went slick in my palm. Laughter cracked like ice across the ballroom, then died, as if someone cut the sound. Danielle's finger stayed pointed at my silver dress like it was evidence. My name is Angela Patrice Carter. I am 62 and at the Whitmore Charity Gala in April 2022. Danielle Whitmore called me a fool in front of 300 guests. Across the room, Edward Whitmore stopped mid-sip, staring at me like he'd just remembered my name. Before I tell you how that night unraveled, I'm curious about something. Where are you listening from right now? A quiet kitchen, a long drive, maybe the end of a hard day. If this story touches a place you recognize, you can tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of it. Stories about family wounds tend to stay with us. And if you've ever been hurt by someone who was supposed to protect you, you'll understand why this night mattered. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, in a narrow brick apartment building that always smelled faintly of machine oil and fried onions. My parents were factory workers. My father came home every night with grease ground into the lines of his hands. My mother kept a stack of folded uniforms on the kitchen chair, ready for the next morning before the sun even thought about rising. Our place was small. 2 bedrooms, thin walls, a radiator that hissed like it was arguing with itself all winter. But the kitchen table was always warm. Homework happened there. Bills got counted there. Dreams, too. My father used to tap the table with his knuckle whenever Marcus and I complained about schoolwork. Learning, he'd say, is the one thing nobody can repossess. Back then I thought he was exaggerating. Life has a way of proving parents right. Years later, I met Richard Carter at a bus stop outside a grocery store on 63rd Street. I was 23 and carrying a bag of canned soup and laundry soap. He offered to help when the paper bag tore open. It was an ordinary moment. But ordinary moments sometimes rearrange entire lives. Richard had an easy laugh and the kind of confidence that made the world seem manageable. We married quickly. Too quickly, some people said. I didn't care. At 24, hope feels stronger than caution. Marcus was born the following spring. I remember the hospital window fogging from the heat while snow fell outside. I remember the weight of him in my arms. 7 pounds, tiny fists, eyes squeezed shut like the world was too bright. For a few years, life felt balanced. Not easy, but balanced. Richard worked construction. I took a job at a small nonprofit organization called Bright Futures Community Network. The office sat above a corner grocery store, and the floors creaked whenever someone walked down the hall. Bright Futures helped families who were barely holding on. Food assistance, job referrals, after-school tutoring. The work was messy and complicated and sometimes heartbreaking, but it mattered. Marcus learned to walk in that apartment on South Ellis Avenue. His footsteps were soft against the worn linoleum floor. Some evenings he'd sit on my lap while I filled out paperwork for work. I used to tell him stories about school and books and places he might one day see. Then, one morning, everything changed. I came home from work and found the apartment quiet in a way that didn't feel normal. The hallway light was still on, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. Richard's closet was empty. The dresser drawers were half open like someone had searched them quickly. On the kitchen counter sat a folded sheet of notebook paper. He didn't leave much explanation. Just a few sentences that felt colder every time I read them. Marcus was 5. For a long time after that, I moved through days like someone walking through water. Every step heavier than the last. Bills arrived with perfect timing. Rent, groceries, school supplies. The world doesn't pause just because your life has cracked open. Bright Futures became more than a job after that. It became a lifeline. I started as an administrative assistant answering phones and sorting paperwork. But every evening, after Marcus went to sleep, I opened textbooks at the kitchen table, nonprofit management, accounting, program development. The lamp above the table cast a yellow circle of light that barely reached the walls. Outside the window, the city hummed quietly. Inside that small circle, I studied. Marcus would sometimes wander into the kitchen, half asleep. "Mom, why are you still awake just learning something?" I'd whisper. He'd nod like that answer made perfect sense and shuffle back to bed. Years passed that way. Bright Futures grew slowly. New programs, more volunteers, more families walking through the doors asking for help. That's when Gloria Bennett entered my life. Gloria had been running the organization since before I was hired. She had silver hair, sharp eyes, and the calm authority of someone who had spent decades solving impossible problems. One afternoon, she stopped beside my desk while I was reviewing a stack of reports. "You see patterns," she said. I looked up. Patterns, numbers, stories, funding gaps. "You notice things other people miss." She handed me a folder. "Come sit in on the next board meeting." That invitation changed everything. The first time I sat in that conference room, I barely spoke. I listened to conversations about budgets, community programs, and literacy initiatives. People argued politely over spreadsheets and projections, but the more I listened, the more I understood how the entire system worked. And slowly, over the next decade, my role inside Bright Futures changed. Coordinator, program manager, director, eventually executive director. The title sounded strange the first time I heard it attached to my name. But by then, the organization had grown far beyond that small office above the grocery store. We ran literacy programs across Chicago. Volunteers worked with children who had never owned a single book. I spent long days traveling between community centers, classrooms, and meetings with donors. The work was exhausting, but every time I watched a child sound out their first sentence, it felt like oxygen. Somewhere along the way, I made one practical decision that later turned into something much larger. About 15 years ago, when property prices were still reasonable, I bought a small commercial building near a transit line. Nothing fancy, just brick walls and a narrow storefront. It was meant to be a long-term investment, something stable for the future. At the time, I had no idea how much that decision would matter. Marcus grew into adulthood during those same years. College, first jobs, new friends. He built a life that didn't revolve around my kitchen table anymore. I was proud of that. Children are supposed to move outward. The first time Marcus mentioned Danielle Whitmore. We were sitting in my living room on a rainy Sunday afternoon. The windows were streaked with water and the smell of coffee filled the room. "She's incredible," he said. His voice carried a certain brightness I hadn't heard before. "She went to great schools. Her family runs Whitmore Holdings." The name meant something even then. Chicago has certain families whose influence stretches quietly through business and charity circles. I smiled. "She sounds impressive." "She is," Marcus said quickly. The first dinner Danielle attended at my house felt careful. She arrived wearing a pale coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her handshake was polite, her smile measured. During dinner, she looked around the dining room in a way that felt like someone studying a museum exhibit. "This house is very cozy," she said. Her voice lingered on the last word. Marcus stared at his plate. The moment passed, but a faint tension stayed behind like a thread pulled loose from fabric. I didn't know it then, but that dinner had already set something in motion. The first time the Whitmores talked wedding money in front of me, it sounded like they were ordering dessert. We were in Linda Whitmore's living room after an engagement gathering with caterers and piano music. Marcus looked proud and nervous. Danielle stayed close to him, palm on his forearm like a claim. Edward smiled. "Both families contribute, keeps everyone invested." Linda slid a folder across the table toward Marcus. "Not me, decor and music," she said. "Danielle has a vision." Marcus glanced at me, asking without words. He didn't want to be the one who couldn't keep up. Danielle's voice stayed sweet. "It's what everyone does, everyone." That word wasn't about unity. It was about entry. I kept my face calm. "I'll review it," I said, driving home. Marcus talked fast about how the Whitmores did things. His hands gripped the wheel like he was holding his place in their world. When he hugged me goodbye, it was quick. Like he didn't want anyone to see him need his mother. Danielle asked me to meet her for lunch a few days later. She chose a bright cafe where the chairs felt like punishment. She arrived late and didn't apologize. "I want us to be close," she said, stirring a drink she never sipped. "No misunderstandings." I waited. She leaned forward. "Marcus says you're private about your work." "I'm busy," I said. "Nonprofit stuff." She smiled. "Admirable. Admire was what people said when they meant small." Then she lowered her voice. "The Whitmores care about appearances. It might help if you keep things simple." My stomach tightened. "Keep yourself small. I've been keeping things simple since I was a girl," I said. "I learned how to stand without pretending." Her smile stiffened. "Good." The gala invitation arrived on thick paper, my son listed as event chair. The charity named was the children's literacy program Bright Futures ran. The work I'd spent my life building. My organization wasn't mentioned. I called Marcus. I got the invitation, I said. You're chairing a pause? Yeah, Edward asked me. You didn't tell me. I've been slammed, he said, and I heard laughter in the background before he went quiet again. I'll be there, I said, because I refused to let his embarrassment decide my behavior, at Lakeshore Convention Center. The ballroom glittered. Chandeliers flashed above marble floors. The air smelled like perfume and champagne. I wore my simple silver satin dress from the department store and kept my posture steady. I found the seating chart, table 42, near the service doors. The Whitmores sat near the stage. Marcus's name was beside Danielle's at their table like they were already one unit. My name wasn't close. I sat at table 42 with strangers who talked about ski houses. Each time, the service doors swung open. Warm kitchen air brushed my shoulders, smelling of butter and roasted meat. The insult kept repeating itself. Marcus spoke about literacy and opportunity. The room applauded. I clapped too, proud and hollow. He thanked Edward. He thanked Linda. He thanked Danielle. He didn't mention me. After the speeches, I drifted to the silent auction tables, paddle in hand, forcing my breathing to stay even. I read the item sheets like they were scripture, needing something solid under my eyes. Behind me, Danielle's voice rose over the music. That's her. A small group of women laughed. Danielle stood in the center, champagne glass tilted, face bright with confidence. One woman said, "Department store dress." Danielle giggled. "She thinks she gets a vote?" Another asked. "What does she do?" "Some little nonprofit," Danielle said. "Works with poor people." My fingers tightened around the paddle. I looked for Marcus. He was near the bar. He glanced toward us, his jaw tightened. Then he turned away. Danielle lifted her glass and pointed right at me. "Ladies," she said. Louder now. "Meet the fool we were talking about." Laughter snapped through the air. My chest went tight. But my face stayed still. I didn't move. I just stood there and felt my son's silence land on me like a shove. I turned back to the auction sheet and wrote a bid with steady ink. Not because I wanted the item, because I wanted proof, in my own handwriting, that I still controlled something. Then Edward's voice cut through. "Wait." He stepped closer, and the color drained from his face as if he'd connected two names at once. "Angela Carter," he said slowly. "Bright Futures." The laughter died. Danielle's smile faltered. "Yes," I said. Calm. Edward stared at Danielle. "Do you know who you just called a fool? Do you know who runs the program we're raising money for tonight?" Linda appeared beside him, hand at her throat. Edward said my title out loud, clear enough for people nearby to hear. "Executive Director, Bright Futures Community Network." Edward's voice dropped, almost desperate. "I looked at the donor report this afternoon," he said. "There's a major pledge tied to this literacy program, the biggest one on the list, marked anonymous." His eyes stayed on mine, searching. I didn't nod. I didn't deny it. I just let my silence speak. The same way Marcus's silence had. Danielle's hand trembled around her glass. Marcus took one step forward, then stopped. Like he couldn't decide which version of me he was allowed to claim. The women who had laughed stopped smiling. Their eyes flicked over my dress, my face, my posture, trying to rebuild their judgment with new information. Marcus stood a few steps away, frozen. The music played on, thin, false. Danielle's lips parted, but nothing came out. Her power had been built on what she thought I was. The moment she learned what I actually was, she had no language left, and I didn't feel bigger. I felt tired, because respect that only arrives after recognition isn't respect. It's fear of consequences. And my own son had forced me to earn basic dignity in a room full of strangers. The grand ballroom didn't go quiet all at once. It cracked in pieces. A laugh stuck in someone's throat. A champagne flute clinked too hard. Edward Whitmore stared at me like he'd finally found the missing name on a file. "Angela Carter," he said. Slow. "Bright Futures Community Network." Danielle's smile faltered. "Dad, why are you talking to her like that?" Edward didn't look at her. "Because I know who she is," he said, voice carrying farther than he meant. "And because I need you to understand what you just did. Linda Whitmore appeared beside him, eyes wide, hands tight around her clutch. Edward nodded towards the stage, toward the banners about literacy and hope. "This gala is for the program you've been bragging about," he said. "The one we print in our brochures, the one Marcus spoke about." He pointed at me with the truth. "Her organization runs it." A ripple moved through the nearby tables. People turned in their seats, heads tilted. Calculations started. "I'm the executive director," I said. "Calm." The words felt plain, like stating the weather. Danielle tried to laugh. It came out thin. "Okay, so she has a job." Marcus stepped closer, just enough for me to feel him behind my shoulder. He hadn't defended me when it mattered. Now he was trying to stand where the fallout wouldn't hit him. Edward's face tightened. "A job?" He looked around at the chandeliers, the white linens, the men in tuxedos who never worried about grocery prices. "This room exists because of her work." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet. A donor report. Clean columns, totals, the kind of paper that decides what programs live and which ones die. "I reviewed this afternoon," Edward said. "There's an anonymous commitment tied to the literacy program. The biggest one connected to tonight?" Danielle's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. "Dad, stop." Edward's eyes stayed on me. "Angela," he said, softer now, almost pleading. "Is it you? I didn't give anyone a performance." "Yes," I said. The air went strange. Servers paused with trays mid-step. People who'd been laughing a minute ago suddenly couldn't find their voices. Even the chandeliers felt harsher, throwing hard light across faces that suddenly wanted to disappear. Marcus stepped into my line of sight. His face was flushed, eyes wet. "Mom," he whispered. The word hit me harder than fool. Not because it was sweet, but because it was late. Because he'd saved it for the moment my name carried weight in this room. "You let her call me that," I said, quiet enough that only he could hear. He shook his head fast. "I didn't. You did," I cut in. "You heard it. You chose silence." Danielle's voice broke, high and frantic. "Marcus, tell her I was joking." Marcus looked at Danielle, then at me, and I watched him realize he couldn't keep two stories alive in the same room. "It wasn't a joke," he said, barely audible. Edward took a step toward me. "Mrs. Carter, we can fix this. I can introduce you properly. We can—" "No," I said. "One word. Final. I'm not going up there." I told him, "I'm not taking a microphone now that everyone's embarrassed." Linda's lips trembled. "Angela, please." I looked at Marcus again. "I came tonight to support you," I said. "I stayed polite when they seated me near the service doors. I stayed calm when your fiancé turned me into a punchline. I did my part." My hand closed around the auction paddle, cheap plastic, a small handle. I set it down carefully on the table like I was putting down a role I was finished playing. "I'm leaving," I said. "And I won't be at your wedding." Marcus flinched. Danielle made a sound like air leaking out of a balloon. I walked across the marble floor as the crowd parted without meaning to. At the doors. I paused long enough to look back. Marcus stood frozen, hands at his sides, watching me like he'd finally understood a mother can walk away. Then I stepped into the cool Chicago night and let the ballroom keep its glitter without me. The night air outside Lakeshore Convention Center felt colder than it should have for April. Chicago wind moved down the street in long, restless breaths, pushing the smell of the lake through the empty sidewalks. I stood there for a moment, letting the noise of the ballroom fade behind the glass doors. Inside, people were still talking. I could feel it. Conversations breaking apart, rebuilding themselves around the truth they had just heard. I walked to my car slowly. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but something inside me felt hollow, like a room where the furniture had been removed. By the time I reached my house, the city had quieted. Street lights cast soft orange pools across the pavement. My porch light glowed the way it always had. My phone started vibrating before I even reached the door. Marcus, Danielle, Edward Whitmore, Linda Whitmore. Voicemails stacked up faster than I could read the notifications. Apologies, explanations. Panic wrapped in polite language. I set the phone on the kitchen counter without listening to a single one. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, the same way I had for decades. Habit is stronger than heartbreak. Bright Futures was already busy when I arrived. Volunteers moved boxes of books down the hallway. Somewhere in the building, a child laughed. Tanya Brooks looked up from her desk. "You okay? I will be," I said. In the conference room later that morning, we reviewed the literacy program expansion. The commitment connected to it was already approved. Paperwork finished. Funds secured. Programs scheduled. Everything moved forward exactly the way it was meant to. Marcus called again that afternoon. I watched his name appear on the screen. For a long time, I didn't answer. Because forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Some doors close quietly, not out of anger, but out of respect for yourself. And sometimes the most powerful decision a mother can make is simply stepping aside and letting her son decide what kind of man he plans to become. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you for listening all the way to the end. Moments like that night at the gala don't disappear quickly. They echo for a long time inside a family. I'm curious where you're listening from today and what you would have done in my place. Would you have stayed in that room? Or would you have walked out the same way I did? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about dignity, family, and hard choices mean something to you, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't loud. They happen in quiet decisions. Marcus still calls sometimes. Sometimes I answer. Sometimes I let the phone ring. And every time I hear it, I remember that respect in a family isn't automatic. It's something people choose, or something they lose.